In my previous video, I've talked about all the steps involved when buying a home in New York City. And one of the most important steps is the decision to buy or rent. But buying is not always better than renting, and vice versa. Renting is not always better than buying. If you made a decision that renting works better in your case, here's a video where we will discuss everything you need to know about renting an apartment in New York City. What is up, everyone? My name is Sargis and I'm a licensed real estate agent based here in New York City. My goal is to give you as much information as I can about New York City real estate. In this video, we're not going to talk about the decision-making process. There is no single correct answer to the question which one is better, buying or renting. And this is a totally different topic for another video. Assuming that you made a decision that renting works better in your case, in this video, we'll break down all the steps involved when renting an apartment in New York City. What are the qualifications and required documents, the timeline and the cost associated with renting in New York City, and a few important questions to ask when looking for a rental apartment. At the end of this video, you will know exactly how the process works. When you're looking to buy an apartment, I always recommend that you work with an agent because the transactions can be very complicated and there are a lot of moving parts. But when it comes to renting, you can totally do this by yourself as long as you do a little bit of research and educate yourself about the process, like by watching this video till the end. First, let's talk about the requirements in order to qualify for a certain type of apartment. The majority of landlords across the city require the tenants to earn minimum 40 to 50 times the monthly rent of the apartment they're applying for. This means that if you're looking to rent an apartment for $3,000 a month, generally speaking, you should be making at least $120,000 per year to qualify for that apartment. Some landlords can be flexible with this number, and depending on the situation, you might be approved if you make a little bit less than 40 times monthly rent. The second requirement would be your credit. Almost all landlords want to see a good credit score. According to Experian, FICO defines the good range between 670 to 739. Number one factor that affects your credit score is your payment history, and this is where the landlords pay most attention to. Now let's discuss a couple of situations here. First, if you're a student or someone who just started an entry-level job and you don't have enough income to show, you have an option to use a guarantor. A lot of landlords do allow the tenants to have a guarantor. Generally speaking, your guarantor needs to make at least 80 to 100 times the monthly rent, and there will be a credit check for your guarantor as well. Your guarantor can be a family member, a relative, a friend, someone who's basically willing to guarantee your rent. The whole point of guarantor is they are also responsible for your rent payments, and this ensures the landlord that if one day you stop making your payments, your guarantor will make the payments for you. If you don't have anyone to guarantee your rent, some landlords might allow you to use a guarantor services. These companies do have some additional paperwork, and just like any other type of service, they also have fees. You can just type in Google search Lease Guarantor Service New York City and find out their requirements and fees. If you do meet the income requirement for the type of the apartment you're looking to rent, the next thing is find out what your credit report looks like. It happens so many times when I receive an application and I'm looking at their credit report, the applicants have no idea that there is a reported late payment. It's always good to monitor your credit score. You can use either Credit Karma, Credit Sesame, or whatever else you want. I have used both. It's very easy to set up an account and just check your profile at least once a month. You want to make sure that everything reported there is accurate, such as your personal information, accounts, payment history, inquiries, and so on. If you do have a late payment or any other derogatory mark reported, which I see pretty often when people open their first credit card, they don't take it seriously, they forget to make a payment, and years later they still see that late payment in their account. If that's the case, when submitting an application, I always recommend to submit some sort of explanation of what happened. This helps a lot. If it is something small that happened years ago, you forgot to make a payment or you never received the bill and it ended up being reported as a late payment or collection account, most of the time when the landlord reads your explanation, they understand and you should be fine. But it also depends on the type of the building you're trying to rent in. We'll talk about this later in the video. If for some reason your credit score is very low or you have more serious issues such as multiple missed payments, large collection accounts, repossession, bankruptcy, foreclosure, you probably need to consider getting a guarantor and finding a place where the guarantors are accepted. Now, assuming you have a good credit and sufficient income, you need to do some preparation before you start looking what's available on the market. Depending on the neighborhood, the rental market in New York City can move pretty quickly. That's why it is important for you to have everything ready in order not to miss out on your dream apartment. Besides credit check, in order to apply for an apartment, you need to go through a process of income verification. These are the most common documents the landlords ask. Your 2 most recent pay stubs, if you're getting paid bi-weekly. If you're getting paid every week, this means your 4 most recent pay stubs, your 2 most recent bank statements, a letter of employment stating your base salary, how long you've been employed, and your position, signed by your current supervisor. Also, a reference letter from your current landlord, personal and professional reference letters, and proof of any assets that you have, such as stocks, bonds, or real estate. Depending on the landlord and the type of the building, you might need to submit the very minimum, such as your pay stubs and credit report, and you're good to go. But there are buildings that might require you to submit some or all other supporting documents I've mentioned before. So what are those building types? When you're looking to rent an apartment in New York City, most of the time you will see 3 types of buildings. This is important. Always pay attention to the building type where you're looking to rent. The process and the requirements are different depending on the building. Most of the time you will see either a condo, a rental building, or a co-op. The difference between those is the form of ownership. Condo is an apartment building where all the units are individually owned and the owners of each unit have a joint ownership in the common elements of the building. A rental building is just a building that is owned by a person or a company, and the apartments inside are rental units. Co-op is a cooperative corporation that owns the entire multi-unit building. Every unit in the building has a specific number of shares allocated to it. When someone buys a co-op unit, they buy shares in the corporation. This means that they own a portion of the stock in a corporation, and the proprietary lease gives them the right to occupy a specific apartment. Most of the time you will hear the word shareholder when referring to a co-op unit owner, because they own shares, not the apartment itself. If this sounds confusing, just watch the videos I have where I talk about everything you need to know about co-op and condo ownership structures. As a renter, you don't have to get into all the details, but it's always good to know the ownership structure and how things work in the building where you live. So let's talk about the things that you need to know as a renter. Most of the time, co-ops are more strict than condos and rental buildings. For a typical co-op, it's a 2-step process. First, you have to be approved by the shareholder, then you have to be approved by the board of directors. And the board can reject your application if you don't meet the building's requirements. For most condos, you do have to submit a board package as well, but generally speaking, if you're approved by the owner and you submit everything that is required in a board package, you should be good to go. A condo board does not qualify the tenants, and they cannot just reject the application, but they can ask for information. They have what's called a right of first refusal. So condos might take a little bit of time as well to go through the board application. Again, all of those I explain in details in my other videos. And when it comes to a rental building, it's usually a lot quicker to get approved and complete all the paperwork. Expect to provide the most substantial documentation when renting in a co-op. And on top of that, just like buying in a co-op requires an interview, renting in a co-op also requires an interview. I've seen co-ops that are very easygoing and don't require an interview, but most of them do. At this point, if you think that you should stay away from co-ops because of the complicated application and review process, just wait. because co-ops might have some good advantages that can work in your favor, and I'll explain that later in the video. Before you start looking for an apartment, there are two types of costs that you will need to budget for. The first one is your monthly expenses. This includes your rent, utilities, amenities, and insurance. The second one is your move-in costs. This can be refundable or non-refundable. Depending on the building, some of the non-refundable fees can be application fee, processing fee, administrative fee, credit check fee, move-in fee, move-out fee. Also, if you hired a real estate agent to find an apartment for you, you will be responsible for a broker's fee as well. And the refundable ones are your security deposit and your move-in deposit. The security deposit will be returned to you after you vacate the apartment without any damage besides the normal wear and tear. And if the building requires a move-in deposit, this usually will be returned to you after your move-in is complete and there is no damage to the building's common areas, such as lobby, doors, stairways, walls, elevators, etc. But always ask the listing agent when this deposit will be returned to you. I've seen some buildings where they hold on to this until end of your lease, and you'll get this deposit back when your move out is complete without causing any damage to the building's common areas. So depending on the building, they might not have a lot of fees, or they might have all the fees that you can possibly think of. Sometimes there are ways to minimize those fees depending on what type of rental market you're in and how well you negotiate. For example, if you don't hire an agent, do a little bit of research, educate yourself about the process, and do all the work yourself, like determine your budget, your search criteria, such as the location, condition, size, and amenities that you absolutely need. Then start your apartment search, narrow down your search results, schedule appointments with a listing agent, have all your paperwork ready to submit, and look for an apartments that are marked as no fee. You won't have a broker's fee. Or if the building charges fees that I mentioned earlier, you might be able to negotiate with the landlord and have them pay some or all of those fees. But be careful when doing this. It all depends on what type of rental market you're in, how long the apartment has been on the market, how many other applications you're competing with, and of course your negotiation skills. Now let's talk about your monthly costs, which are your rent, utilities, amenities, and insurance. The 40x rent requirement is also known as 30% rule, which means you allocate 30% of your monthly gross salary to your housing expenses. In our previous example, if you're making $120,000 per year, that is a $10,000 gross monthly income, which means you will be qualified for $3,000 per month apartment. Some landlords are flexible with this number and might allow you to spend as high as 40 to 45% of your monthly gross income to your rent payment. But just because you can be approved doesn't necessarily mean that you should go ahead and do that. Everyone's situation is different. It is your responsibility to figure out how much your housing expenses should be. If you have a student loan, a credit card debt, or any other type of high interest loans, you might want to consider renting a little bit less expensive apartments and pay off those debts first. If you decide that you want to go with 30% rule, you might want to consider including here your other monthly expenses as well, just to be safe. Usually you have to pay for your utilities separate, but in some cases it might be included in your rent. In a lot of pre-war buildings, most of the time heat and hot water is included in the rent. If you're renting in a newer building, those have separate climate control system or an individual HVAC system for all units. In this case, you will be responsible for your heat and AC. Depending on your usage, for an average 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment located in Manhattan, your utility bills can be anywhere between $50 to $300 or more per month. Again, this is just a general estimation for an average 1-bed, 1-bath apartment depending on the usage. Amenities such as bike room, gym, pool, or other recreational facilities can also be included in your rent, or you might need to pay them separate. And the fees can vary a lot depending on the type of the building. New constructions usually have a lot of amenities, and it can be expensive if those are separate from your rent. And when it comes to renter's insurance, this covers your belongings from loss or damage due to things like fire, water damage, and more. You also should be able to add some personal liability coverage. Your basic insurance premium can be as little as $10 to $20 per month. This is just a general estimate, and that's what I see mostly. But it depends on what type of personal property you have, your coverage limits, and many other factors. The bottom line is, this is very important, and always have renter's insurance. During the viewing, ask the agent if it's okay to take some photos and video for your own reference. When asking questions, always take notes. It might seem like it's easy to remember, but trust me, when you see 5 to 10 apartments, you'll start getting lost. And it might be challenging for you to remember later which one said the utilities are included, which one said there is no application fee, and things like that. Now let's talk about the questions you should be asking when looking for an apartment. Remember, always take notes. What utilities are included and what are the application and moving costs? What is the pet policy? Many buildings have certain breed restrictions and weight limits. How long does it take to get an approval and what are the required documents? Now let's talk about these two a little bit. Rental buildings and some condos can take way less time than co-ops. Generally speaking, on average, I see in a co-op it takes 2 to 3 weeks to get approved. In some cases, it might even take 4 to 5 weeks to go through an approval process and get all the paperwork done. This depends on the board and the management company. And I also have seen co-ops that are much faster and get things done within a week. For condos, after submitting the board package, you're not waiting for an approval or rejection. You're waiting for the condo board to waive its right of first refusal. For most condos, they typically have 30 days to do so. Some buildings can take a few days and some can be a little longer. But on average for condos, I see things are getting done within a week or two. But again, this depends on the board and the management company. Rental buildings typically take a few days up to a week. In some cases, maybe 2 weeks depending on the management. This is important to know so you can properly plan your move-in. Next question, how do you handle any emergency repairs? Large apartment buildings usually have a live-in super who's always on site in case if you're having any emergencies. Small buildings usually have a part-time super or a handyman that handles the building's maintenance. You always want to make sure they have someone who you can call in case of emergencies. Next, what does the lease renewal process look like? Some buildings might charge additional one-time fees for lease renewals, so make sure that you are aware of those. How long is the landlord planning to lease the apartment? This is very important because if you're tired of moving every year and you need a place for a long term, you want to find out how long you will be able to live there before signing the lease. Is the owner a professional landlord or someone who decided to rent their apartment for a year or two and they're planning to come back and live there? If you're in a rental building, you're pretty much safe to have an option to renew your lease every year, as long as there are no issues and the company wants to keep you as a tenant. If it's a condo or a co-op, ask the agent if there is a limit on how many years the owner is allowed to rent the unit. A lot of co-ops have caps on how many years the shareholders are allowed to sublet their apartments. Generally speaking, condo unit owners are pretty much free to rent their apartments anytime, but I have seen condos that also have some sort of rental rules. The whole process on average can take anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, depending on how fast you find an apartment you like, how fast you submit all your paperwork, and how fast the agent and the management company work. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is what are the advantages of renting in a co-op. The first thing that I can think of is you have less competition if your finances and credit are in good standing. Co-ops are known for being strict. That's why a lot of people who don't have great financials or credit, or they don't want to disclose all their financials, might not even look in a co-op building. The next thing is you have a community in a co-op. Since co-ops have strict financial requirements and the applicants have to go through a board approval process, a co-op board is usually very careful who they pick as a tenant. It is less likely that in a co-op you'll have a noisy neighbor who likes to party all night and cause inconveniences. In a typical rental building, the chances are much higher that you'll end up having this kind of neighbor. The other advantage would be, and that's also the case for some condos, the communication is much more personal. What I mean by that is you are dealing directly with the owner if it's a condo, or with a shareholder if it's a co-op. And during the rent negotiations or lease renewals, there are a lot more emotions involved, since you will be living in their apartment. If they see in you a responsible person, a long-term tenant with a good credit and stable income, you have more chances to negotiate some concessions when deciding to apply for the apartment. It could be slightly discount on rent, early move-in, free month, or some or all building fees paid by the owner, and things like that. Or when it's time to renew your lease, if you were a good tenant, took good care of the apartment, always paid the rent on time, and never caused any inconveniences, you'll have more leverage when it comes to rent increase negotiations. Most likely in this case, they would want to keep you as a tenant to avoid any vacancies and go through the whole process again and pay their broker to find a new tenant. And the chances are high that they will work with you and your rate can stay the same, or they'll keep the increase to a minimum. On the other hand, with big companies that own multiple rental buildings, you don't have that much of a leverage. In this case, you're dealing with a management company. If you're okay with rates, great. If not, they'll find another tenant. For a big company that owns dozens or hundreds of rental units, having 1 or 2 months of vacancy for one unit wouldn't be a big deal. That's it for today's video. If you got any valuable information, just by tapping that like button and subscribing to the channel will be a huge favor. Thank you for watching. Until next time.